I start with Germany, let's say from the developed world, how they coped with this challenge of making parliament relevant during such a crisis. Brynne, the floor is yours, and you're talking about exploring the impact of the pandemic on the relationship between the executive and the legislature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shamoon, and thank you very much for having me today. It's really an honor to speak to all of you on a topic that is, as everyone has said, so important and will become even more important as our new normal develops and as our changing world, as our world changes rather, to accommodate the regulations and the different needs that COVID brings about. So as Shamoon said, I am based in Germany, but I'm actually South African. So I hope that you will allow me to indulge in what I hope will be a comparative discussion about a number of different approaches that states around the world have taken. And I hope you'll indulge me to speak a little bit about my home country as well. So firstly, I think that there have been a number of buzzwords that have kind of come out around this pandemic. We've said it's unprecedented times. We've called them challenging times. Some government officials have declared war on COVID. And I guess it's understandable in the sense that it's a highly infectious disease that we know very little about. And in dealing with it, we've needed to limit a number of fundamental rights and freedoms. And we've needed to suspend things that are such an ordinary part of everyday life, whether it's school, work, university, or just everyday movement. In reality, the COVID pandemic has changed everything about the way that we interact with one another and interact with society. And that includes the way that the executive, the legislature, and the courts interact with one another through our traditional understanding of the separation of powers. So I guess a first premise that I'd like to discuss is really that there's been a trend around the world that in dealing with this COVID pandemic, there's been an amassing of executive power in a manner that I would say is akin to a state of emergency, or what we would see in traditional states of emergency. And there's a lot of classical scholarship around why it is necessary that in particular emergency situations, the executive takes certain powers in terms of decision making and even in terms of legislating. And this scholarship is, it speaks to the fact that decisions need to be quick. They need to be decisive rather than deliberative. And sometimes they need to be based on things such as confidential material when you're thinking about a war, an enemy aggressor, even things such as financial crises. And I would say that the COVID pandemic is sure analogous in some ways to these traditional states of emergency, in that we needed a very swift response, we needed a decisive response, but it also has key differences to what we classically think of as the things that give rise to states of emergency, in that there's less of an information asymmetry between different arms of government, in that often information about the pandemic is held with health professionals rather than the executive, or that there needs to be collaboration between private and public bodies and different sectors. But more than that, we have no idea how long this is going to go on for. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave, a third wave, whether this is the new normal, and it's affected the rights and liberties of individuals en masse around the world. It's not in a limited location. And so what that means is that sure, there's this classical scholarship on states of emergency and the need to amass executive powers in these kinds of emergencies. But if this is going to become the new normal, that also re-emphasizes the importance of the separation of powers and the need for checks and balances that it gives rise to. So I think if we start to look at the way that different countries have reacted to this pandemic, of course, we first recognize that it's been very difficult for parliaments in such a situation. The fact is that a lot of people gathering together in a small chamber is an infection risk. The fact is that often parliamentarians need to travel from different parts of the country to get to their Congress. And when there are travel bans or movement restrictions, that becomes increasingly difficult. Also, parliaments take time to pass legislation, and that is the antithesis of the swift response that we've spoken about needing for this pandemic. Of course, there are also procedural bars, such as the need to amend the rules of parliament or the rules of procedures, or even in some cases, such as in Switzerland, the need to amend the constitution so that parliaments could sit virtually. And so states have kind of taken one of two responses in terms of dealing with the pandemic. So either they've taken a legislative response to giving certain powers to the executive, and this would be through passing either new legislation, relying on existing legislation, or amending existing legislation, which allows parliaments to delegate certain lawmaking powers around an emergency to the executive. And here countries such as Germany, France, Australia, South Africa have all followed this approach, where they've relied on a piece of legislation that allows the government to declare either a state of emergency or a state of a health disaster, and in terms of that, to amass certain powers to create legislation related specifically to that crisis that is covered in terms of that piece of legislation. The second approach is, I guess, the constitutional approach, where states have declared formal constitutional states of emergency. And I'd say that this happens in probably has happened in a minority of cases, but examples include Spain, Hungary, Senegal. And here there are, of course, whatever checks and balances exist within those constitutional provisions. So if those are the two existing methods or general methods that states have perhaps pursued in order to address this and in order to give certain powers to the executive, what is the role of Parliament in each of those? How does Parliament, even if certain legislating powers have been removed from them and delegated to the executive, deal with that? So of course, there is the direct role that Parliament plays in all of that. So if the legislative approach was taken, that means potentially drafting new legislation to deal specifically with COVID and empower the executive to take legislative decisions in terms of that legislation, or amending legislation. And here there are a lot of examples where countries, for instance, have amended legislation to build in new oversight procedures. So Japan, for instance, amended their existing public health legislation to require that the government reports to Parliament periodically about the COVID situation. Or Germany amended their public health legislation to ensure that any regulations which were promulgated in terms of that legislation were approved by Parliament. Or countries such as Liberia, New Zealand have set up separate oversight committees in terms of that empowering legislation and amendments made to that empowering legislation. So the direct impact or the direct role of Parliament in such a situation, I guess, is kind of understandable. Similarly, where countries relied on the constitutional approach, it's often the role of Parliament either to declare a state of emergency or to approve that state of emergency after a particular period of time, or even review that state of emergency in terms of when the government asks for an extension. So for instance, in Spain, the government declared a state of emergency in terms of the constitution. And then every 2 weeks, essentially, in order to extend that, Parliament needs to hold the debate, have reports from government in order to declare that that extension happens. So the direct role in terms of both approaches is quite clear. But what happens when oversight is less clear, when it isn't built into the legislation, and when it isn't perhaps as obvious? And here I'd like to turn to the South African example. So in South Africa, we declared a state of disaster, which is not something that is contained in the Constitution, but rather something that is contained in the Disaster Management Act. And the Disaster Management Act doesn't provide for any legislative oversight. In fact, it provides that a state of disaster can be declared for 3 months, and after that 3-month period, the minister, rather than Parliament, can extend that state of disaster in perpetuity. And it's interesting because the decision by government to rely on this act, this Disaster Management Act, was in spite of the fact that we have a constitutional provision that allows for the declaration of a state of emergency, and we have other legislation that allows for declarations of states of emergency or variants of a state of emergency, but also require legislative oversight. So it's an interesting dichotomy where essentially the state chose an option that they chose to rely and invoke a power in an act that also simultaneously removed the powers of Parliament in terms of oversight. And that's difficult, because what then can Parliament do? How can they ensure that their oversight role is not eroded? There are a couple of lessons from around the world that might be instructive. So first and foremost, I think it is, of course, difficult in these times to have things such as debates in the plenum, where it's very hard for parliamentarians to meet en masse. But we've seen innovative approaches to the way that technology can be used. And we've seen innovative approaches even to creating hybrid parliaments, where, for instance, certain members have been allowed to come into the central meeting area, and others have been included in those discussions using technology. And that's whether they are far away and can't get there because of travel restrictions, or because they're part of a risk group. And those kind of hybrid solutions are useful because it means that you can still have the general oversight function of having the government make statements in the plenum and having a basic debate around those statements. And so parliaments who place those government statements on their agenda mean that they can continue to ask questions around that. The Netherlands is a good example of this, where thankfully their chamber was essentially big enough that certain parliamentarians could have their meetings in a socially distanced fashion. And what they did was they had weekly debates where government representatives, the Prime Minister, as well as experts from health sectors, etc., would come in and they would make statements to Parliament. And this was not in terms of any piece of legislation that required it, but rather because parliamentarians themselves called for this by placing the making of such statements on the agenda. The second way, I suppose, of doing this and ensuring that oversight continues is by things such as questioning, and so traditional questioning mechanisms, both in the plenum and at the committee level. And I think that that's one of the big takeaways here, is that the committees in terms of oversight have been particularly effective, or offer the opportunity to be particularly effective, because smaller groups of people can perhaps meet more easily over online platforms. And so calling on representatives of government to make representations about the work that they are doing, either in the plenum, if you have a hybrid system and it's possible, or in the committee stages, can be extremely useful. And here we can look at the fact that in the UK, things such as question time went ahead, or even that parliamentary select committees are holding inquiries and hearing evidence electronically. So it may require a slight change in the rules of procedure of those committees, but committees can continue to work and can continue to have inquiries into issues around COVID and around these kinds of problems. Another way of approaching oversight is by the creation of ad hoc committees within Parliament who carry out COVID inquiries. And this would be the creation of essentially a separate ad hoc committee, which Parliament is disposed to do, in order to look at the way that COVID regulations or COVID approaches are taken. Again, they then have all of the evidence gathering mechanisms. And I suppose instead of having separate committees based on the different portfolios, you can have one central committee based specifically around COVID. Belgium and the UK are good examples of this. And of course, I think that in terms of the way that we look at our traditional oversight mechanisms, whether it's budgetary oversight, where of course you need as much information as possible to carry out that oversight. I think it's important that you think about the way that transparency can be enhanced in times of COVID, the way that technology means that you can be innovative, and the way that even when the legislation that empowers the executive to amass certain powers doesn't empower you to exercise oversight, you are able to be creative and adapt your existing mechanisms to ensure that parliamentary oversight continues. It appears that the most successful instances where parliaments have been able to be involved in this COVID-19 crisis is where they have recognized the need to change how they operate, how they treat the emergency situation, and how they view their role, because this is going to continue for a long time. And I think that we need to think about the way that parliaments can balance that, because at some stage this might become the new normal, and then we don't want all power concentrated in the executive. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'm being told to wrap up, so I'm going to leave it at that. But those are just a few ideas, and I'd be happy to discuss more about the way that different countries have used them around the world. Thank you.